The crisp, luxurious interior of the first-class cabin on Flight 708 from Los Angeles to New York was buzzing with the muted conversations of wealthy travelers. Champagne glasses clinked gently as flight attendants moved with practiced ease, ensuring that each passenger was comfortable. Among them sat a man who was impossible to ignore, the legendary Samuel L. Jackson. Dressed in his signature cool, casual attire, dark shades, a sleek leather jacket, and a Kangol hat, Jackson leaned back in his plush seat, browsing through his tablet. He was no stranger to flying first class, having done so countless times over the years. But today was about to take an unexpected turn. A young flight attendant, Rebecca Harris, fresh on the job and eager to make an impression, walked down the aisle, her eyes scanning the passengers. As she reached Jackson's seat, her expression tightened slightly. She hesitated before clearing her throat. "Sir," she said politely but firmly, "I believe you're in the wrong seat. This section is reserved for first-class passengers." Jackson, mid-swipe on his tablet, slowly looked up over his shades. "I am a first-class passenger," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable deep, authoritative timbre that had captivated audiences for decades. Rebecca, however, was unconvinced. "I'm sorry, sir, but this seat is for paying first-class ticket holders only. If you could kindly return to economy, I'd be happy to assist you in finding your correct seat." A hush fell over the nearby passengers. Some glanced at Jackson, recognizing him immediately. Others merely observed, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Jackson chuckled, a slow, amused yet disbelieving laugh. "So, let me get this straight," he said, lowering his shades slightly. "You think I snuck into first class?" Rebecca, still firm but now slightly flustered, nodded. "Yes, sir. I don't see your name on the manifest, and I—" Before she could finish, the senior flight attendant, Linda Crawford, approached. Unlike Rebecca, Linda immediately recognized Jackson and her face paled. "Mr. Jackson, my apologies, sir. Is there a problem?" Rebecca, confused, looked between them. "Wait, Mr. Jackson? As in, Samuel L." Jackson sighed, shaking his head. "That's Samuel L. Jackson," he said dryly. Rebecca's face flushed deep red. But it was too late, the damage had been done. And what happened next would not only shock the entire plane but leave Rebecca in tears. Rebecca's face turned ghostly pale as realization sank in. She had just accused Samuel L. Jackson, one of the most recognizable actors on the planet, of sneaking into first class. A lump formed in her throat, but she hesitated to back down completely. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, gripping the manifest in her trembling hands. "I just didn't see your name on the list." Linda, the senior flight attendant, shot her a sharp glance. "Rebecca, please step aside. Mr. Jackson is exactly where he should be." But before Rebecca could respond, Jackson raised a hand, signaling them both to pause. His expression had changed. The light amusement from earlier had vanished, replaced by something unreadable. He slowly removed his sunglasses and leaned forward. "I see what's going on here," he said in a dangerously calm tone. "You didn't see my name on the list, and you assumed I didn't belong here." Rebecca swallowed hard. "No, sir, I didn't mean. I've flown first class more times than I can count," Jackson continued, his voice measured but firm. "And I pay for my tickets just like anyone else. But let me guess, I didn't look like I belonged." The tension in the cabin thickened. A few passengers subtly pulled out their phones, eager to capture what was quickly becoming a viral moment. Rebecca, still desperate to salvage the situation, tried again. I was just following protocol, sir." Jackson's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "Protocol? Ha! That's a nice way of saying, I judged you before I checked the facts." At that moment, the plane's captain, Captain Douglas Pierce, entered the cabin. The whispers and murmurs had reached the cockpit, and he had come to investigate. Seeing Jackson and the tension-filled atmosphere, he frowned. "What seems to be the problem here?" the captain asked. Before Linda could explain, Rebecca spoke first. "Captain, I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't check properly, and I thought Mr. Jackson wasn't supposed to be in first class." Captain Pierce's face darkened. He turned to Jackson. "Mr. Jackson, I sincerely apologize on behalf of the airline. This was an unfortunate misunderstanding." Jackson exhaled, shaking his head. "You know, I'd be lying if I said this was the first time something like this happened," he said. "But it should be the last." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Rebecca's eyes welled up with tears, but the moment wasn't over yet. What happened next would completely change the course of the flight. Rebecca's hands trembled as she clutched the manifest. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, and the lump in her throat grew thicker. "Samuel L." Jackson sighed and leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "All right," he said, his voice calmer but still laced with disappointment. "So what happens now?" Captain Pierce turned to Rebecca, his expression unreadable. "Rebecca," he said firmly, "I think you owe Mr. Jackson a proper apology." Rebecca swallowed hard and nodded. She turned to Jackson, her voice shaky. I'm so sorry, sir. I should have double-checked before assuming anything. It wasn't my intention to disrespect you." Jackson studied her for a moment, his piercing gaze making her feel smaller by the second. Then, after a long pause, he simply said, "You know what? I believe you." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. You do." Jackson let out a slow, measured exhale. "Yeah, you're new, right?" She nodded quickly, her lower lip trembling. He shook his head. "See, here's the thing, Rebecca. A mistake like this might seem small to you, but to me, it's the same kind of mistake I've seen my whole damn life. People assuming, people judging." He leaned in slightly. "So, you tell me, what makes this different?" Rebecca had no answer. Her throat tightened, and despite her attempts to hold them back, tears began welling up in her eyes. Linda, the senior flight attendant, placed a reassuring hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "Mr. Jackson," she said gently, "Rebecca truly didn't mean any harm. She's just starting out, and she's still learning." Jackson tilted his head, considering this. Then he smirked. "Well," he said, "if she's still learning, let's make this a lesson she won't forget." Rebecca wiped her eyes quickly and nodded. "I promise, sir. I'll never make this mistake again." Jackson's smirk grew wider. "Good. Now, how about you get me some of that first-class champagne so we can put this behind us?" A nervous chuckle rippled through the nearby passengers, breaking the tension. Rebecca, grateful for the second chance, nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Jackson. Right away." Just as she turned to leave, Jackson called after her. "And, Rebecca?" She spun back around, still flustered. "Yes, sir." He lifted his sunglasses back onto his face. "Next time, don't assume. Ask first." Rebecca nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. Understood." She rushed off to retrieve the champagne, her hands still shaking. Meanwhile, Captain Pierce turned to Jackson and let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Jackson." Jackson gave a small nod. "No problem, Captain. But if you really want to make it up to me, tell the pilot to make this flight real smooth. I need my rest." Captain Pierce chuckled and patted Jackson's shoulder. "I'll see what I can do." As the flight settled back into normalcy, no one could have predicted that this was only the beginning of what would turn out to be an unforgettable journey. Rebecca returned moments later, carefully balancing a tray with a glass of first-class champagne. Her hands still trembled slightly as she set it down on Samuel L. Jackson's tray table. "There you go, sir," she said softly, her voice still shaky. Jackson picked up the glass, swirled the golden liquid for a moment, then took a slow sip. He smacked his lips, nodded approvingly, and set the glass down. "All right," he said, finally offering a small smile. "That's more like it." Rebecca exhaled, relieved that the tension had finally begun to fade. She turned to walk away, but Jackson's voice stopped her again. "Hold up," he said. She turned back hesitantly. Jackson leaned in slightly, resting his elbows on his armrests. "What made you assume I didn't belong here?" The question hit Rebecca like a ton of bricks. She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. She knew there was no good excuse, no way to spin it. I don't know," she admitted. She sighed, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I was nervous. I wanted to make sure I was doing my job right, and I panicked. I saw you, I didn't see your name on the list, and I messed up." Jackson studied her for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle. "Well, at least you're honest," he said. Rebecca managed a small smile. "I really am sorry, sir." "Apology accepted," Jackson said, waving a dismissive hand. "Just do better next time." She nodded quickly, relieved. Just then, the plane jolted slightly, causing a few passengers to glance up. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and a voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're expecting a bit of turbulence ahead, so please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Rebecca instinctively grabbed onto a seat for balance as the aircraft vibrated slightly. She had been trained for turbulence, but she still hated it. Jackson, however, didn't seem fazed in the slightest. He took another sip of his champagne and leaned back, looking entirely unfazed. "Turbulence," he muttered. "Ain't nothing but a little shake and bake." Rebecca smiled slightly at his nonchalance, then excused herself to check on other passengers. But as she made her way to the back of the first-class cabin, she noticed something unusual. A man, seated 3 rows behind Jackson, had his hoodie pulled low over his face. His hands were clenched tightly together, and he kept shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Rebecca's instincts kicked in. Something about him seemed off. She decided to keep an eye on him. What she didn't realize was that the next few hours of this flight were about to take a shocking turn, one that would change her life forever. Rebecca kept glancing back at the man in the hoodie as she moved through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers. Something about him wasn't right. While turbulence often made passengers uneasy, this guy wasn't just nervous, he looked agitated. His foot tapped anxiously, his hands fidgeted under his tray table, and he kept looking around as if he was waiting for something. She knew better than to jump to conclusions again after what had just happened with Samuel L. Jackson. But this time, her gut told her something was off. She approached her senior colleague, Linda, who was preparing drinks at the galley. "Hey," Rebecca whispered, leaning in. "That guy in 3F. Have you noticed anything weird about him?" Linda raised an eyebrow and peeked toward the passenger in question. "You mean the one with the hoodie?" Rebecca nodded. Linda sighed. "I saw him bored. Didn't say much. Just handed over his ticket and kept his head down." "Why? Something wrong?" Rebecca hesitated. "I don't know. He just looks tense. Like he's about to do something." Linda gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Don't stress too much, Rebecca. First big mistake of the day already got you rattled. Just keep an eye on him, but don't assume the worst." Rebecca nodded, trying to shake off the paranoia. But something in her gut told her this wasn't just a case of first-flight jitters. She decided to casually pass by the man's seat and check if she could spot anything unusual. As she walked past, she caught a glimpse of his hands. His fingers were drumming rapidly on his tray table, and there was a slight bulge under his jacket. A square-shaped bulge. Her breath hitched. A weapon. She forced herself to keep moving, pretending not to notice, but her heart was racing. She had been trained in handling difficult passengers, but if this was what she feared it was, she needed backup. She hurried back toward Linda and the flight crew's intercom. Just as she reached for the handset to notify the captain, a deep voice interrupted her thoughts. "What's wrong?" She turned to find Samuel L. Jackson watching her intently. His piercing gaze locked onto hers. For a second, she hesitated. But then she realized, if there was anyone on this plane who could handle a crisis, it was him. "There's a guy in 3F, she whispered quickly. "Something's not right. I think he might have a weapon." Jackson's eyes narrowed. He glanced toward the seat, his expression unreadable. Then, ever so slowly, his lips curled into a familiar, knowing smirk. Well, he muttered under his breath. Ain't that some s-" Before he could finish, the man in 3F suddenly stood up. The entire cabin fell silent. A sharp clank echoed through the cabin as the suspicious man in 3F shoved his tray table upward and sprang to his feet. His hoodie slipped back slightly, revealing a thin layer of sweat on his forehead. He reached inside his jacket, and in one swift motion he yanked out a small black pistol. A collective gasp swept through the first-class cabin. Someone let out a stifled scream. Passengers froze in their seats, gripping their armrests, their eyes wide with fear. Rebecca's blood ran cold. She had been right. "Nobody move!" the man barked, his voice cracking under pressure. His hands shook slightly as he pointed the gun toward the aisle. "I don't want to hurt nobody, but I will if I have to." Samuel L. Jackson, still seated, slowly removed his sunglasses, his face shifting into a steely expression. His jaw clenched. This wasn't the first time he had faced danger. Rebecca instinctively took a step back toward the galley, but Linda grabbed her wrist, signaling her to stay put. The senior flight attendant whispered under her breath, "Stay calm. We'll handle this." But Samuel L. Jackson had other ideas. The man in 3F turned his weapon toward the front of the cabin, his eyes darting between the pilot's door and the terrified passengers. "I need access to the cockpit," he demanded. "Now." Jackson, still seated, let out a slow exhale. Then, in his signature calm but terrifying voice, he spoke. "You sure about this, kid?" The hijacker snapped his gaze toward him. "Shut up," he shouted, stepping closer. Jackson didn't flinch. Not even a little. "You're shaking," Jackson observed coolly. "I've seen a lot of people hold a gun, and let me tell you something, you ain't got the hands for it." The hijacker's nostrils flared. He gripped the weapon tighter. "I swear, I'll shoot you." Jackson cocked his head, his smirk dangerous. "You sure about that?" A beat of silence. The hijacker hesitated. And then, in a move so fast that most people missed it, Jackson shot up from his seat like lightning. His hand lashed out, grabbing the hijacker's wrist before he could react. With one swift twist, Jackson wrenched the gun to the side. Bang! The gun fired, a deafening crack that sent everyone ducking. The bullet tore through a seat, missing a passenger by mere inches. Jackson didn't stop. Using sheer force, he twisted the hijacker's arm behind his back, slamming him against the seat. Passengers screamed. The hijacker grunted in pain, struggling, but Jackson held firm. He leaned in close and growled, "You just tried to hijack a plane with me on it?" The hijacker thrashed, but Jackson tightened his grip. "Linda," he barked, "get the zip ties." Linda, recovering from the shock, rushed to the galley and grabbed the security restraints used for unruly passengers. Rebecca was frozen, her pulse hammering. Passengers in first class stared in stunned silence. They had just watched Samuel L. Jackson take down a hijacker with his bare hands. Jackson yanked the man's arms back as Linda and another crew member secured his wrists with zip ties. The hijacker was neutralized. For a few long seconds, there was nothing but heavy breathing and stunned silence. Then someone at the back of first class started clapping. Slowly, it spread. One by one, passengers broke into applause. Some cheered, some laughed in sheer disbelief. Rebecca exhaled shakily, her legs weak beneath her. Jackson dusted off his jacket and turned toward the passengers. He smirked. "Well," he said, slipping his sunglasses back on, "now that that's handled, can I finish my damn champagne?" Rebecca's breath hitched as the captain's urgent voice crackled through the intercom. "Mayday, mayday. This is Captain Reynolds. We are experiencing a critical systems failure. I repeat, we have a problem." The moment those words echoed through the plane, a new wave of panic surged through the passengers. Murmurs turned into frantic whispers. Rebecca's fingers tightened around the seat she was gripping. Samuel L. Jackson stood up, rolling his shoulders like he had just finished an intense workout. He wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow and turned to Rebecca. "You gotta be kidding me." Rebecca didn't waste time. She sprinted toward the cockpit, barely dodging shaken passengers gripping their seats in terror. Jackson followed closely behind her. She reached the cockpit door and pressed the intercom button. "Captain, this is Rebecca from first class. What's going on?" Static crackled before the captain's voice came through, tense and urgent. "We're losing hydraulic control. One of the hijackers must have tampered with our avionics. We can't maintain altitude." Rebecca's stomach dropped. Losing hydraulic control? That meant the pilots were struggling to steer the plane. If they couldn't stabilize it, Jackson, standing right behind her, crossed his arms. "Open the damn door and tell me what needs fixing." Rebecca turned to him in shock. "You can't just." The door clicked, unlocking. The captain himself opened it. Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran with over 20 years of flight experience, looked more stressed than he probably ever had in his career. His co-pilot was frantically flipping switches, trying to regain control. "I can't believe I'm saying this," the captain muttered, eyeing Jackson. "But I need all the help I can get." Jackson stepped inside like he belonged there. "What are we dealing with?" The captain pointed to the control panel, where red warning lights were flashing. "The hijacker must have sabotaged our hydraulic system. We're losing control of the rudder and stabilizers." Jackson stared at the controls, then turned to Rebecca. "Hydraulics, huh?" He smirked. "Good thing I've done this before." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Wait, you know how to fly a plane?" Jackson shrugged. "Nah, but I was in Snakes on a plane. That's gotta count for something." Rebecca stared at him, her brain short-circuiting. The co-pilot whipped his head around. "This is not a movie. We're in a real crisis." Jackson sighed. "Relax, I'm messing with you. What do we actually need to do?" Captain Reynolds took a deep breath. "We need to manually reset the hydraulic bypass valves in the avionics bay beneath the plane. If we don't, we won't be able to land safely." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "But that means someone has to go into the maintenance access hatch under the cabin." The co-pilot nodded grimly. "It's dangerous. There's turbulence, limited space, and if the system is too far gone, it might not even work." Before anyone else could react, Jackson cracked his knuckles. "Well, guess I'm going in." Rebecca's jaw dropped. "Wait, you can't just." Jackson turned to her, smirking. "You gonna stop me?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. No, she wasn't." The captain nodded. "All right, follow me. We need to move fast." As Jackson and Captain Reynolds moved toward the access hatch, Rebecca glanced out the cockpit window. The clouds were getting closer. They were going down fast. The plane lurched violently, causing Rebecca to stumble against the cockpit doorway. Outside the windows, the sky was no longer the serene blue from earlier. It was a chaotic blur of rushing clouds and tilting horizon lines. They were descending too fast. Jackson and Captain Reynolds hurried through the narrow aisle toward the maintenance access hatch, located near the rear of the first-class section. Linda, who was still keeping an eye on the restrained hijackers, looked up in alarm. "Where are you going?" "Fixing this damn plane," Jackson replied, his tone deadly serious. Rebecca followed, heart hammering in her chest. She had spent years in the airline industry, but never had she been in a situation like this. If the hydraulics weren't restored, they wouldn't be able to control the plane's descent, meaning no safe landing. As they reached the hatch, Captain Reynolds knelt down and unlocked it, revealing a narrow, ladder-like passage leading into the dark belly of the aircraft. Jackson peered down. "Tight squeeze." "You don't have to do this," Rebecca said, barely recognizing her own voice. "It's too dangerous." Jackson glanced at her, then at the panicked passengers gripping their armrests, some praying, some sobbing. "You think I'm about to let all these people die?" He smirked. "Hell no." Then he dropped down into the hatch. Rebecca swallowed hard as she and the captain peered inside. The space was cramped, dimly lit, and vibrating from the plane's unsteady movements. Jackson landed with a grunt. "All right, where's this hydraulic thing?" The captain's voice echoed from above. "Look for a metal panel marked HYDB3. You'll need to reset the bypass valve manually." Jackson moved forward, crouching through the narrow space. He reached out, gripping the sides of the plane's metal framework to steady himself. The hum of the aircraft's struggling systems was deafening. Then he spotted it, a red, blinking warning light. There. The HYDB-3 panel was mounted on the side, partially obscured by tangled wires and tubing. Jackson reached out and yanked it open. Inside, he found a mess of hydraulic controls. "Okay," he muttered. "Now, which one do I?" Suddenly, the plane jerked violently. Jackson slammed into the metal wall, letting out a grunt of pain. Above, Rebecca and the captain nearly lost their footing. "Jackson!" Rebecca yelled. "Are you okay?" "Still alive," he growled. "Barely." Another sharp dip. Passengers screamed. The plane was losing altitude too quickly. Jackson clenched his teeth. "All right, let's do this." With a deep breath, he reached for the bypass valve. It was stuck. "Oh, hell no." Gritting his teeth, Jackson wrapped both hands around it and pulled. Nothing. Rebecca's voice crackled over the intercom. "You need to turn it counterclockwise." Jackson braced his foot against the metal framework and twisted with everything he had. "Come on, you piece of..." Then, crack. The valve suddenly released, and the hydraulic system roared back to life. In the cockpit, the co-pilot shouted, "We got our controls back." Captain Reynolds grabbed the yoke, steering the plane upward. "Brace for impact. We're still coming in fast." In the cabin, the oxygen masks swayed as passengers clutched their seats, tears streaming down their faces. Rebecca gripped the wall, whispering, "Come on, come on." Then, from the cockpit, the captain's voice rang out through the intercom. "We have control. I repeat, we have control." In the avionics bay, Jackson let out a deep breath, leaning back against the cold metal wall. Then he grinned. "Damn, I'm good." But they weren't safe yet. They were still coming in for an emergency landing. And there was one last problem. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds gritted his teeth. "Brace for impact in 10, 9, 8. The plane shook violently as the runway came into view. 5, 4, 3. Rebecca grabbed onto the nearest seat. 2, 1. Boom. The wheels slammed onto the tarmac. The plane bounced once, twice before skidding forward. Smoke billowed from the tires as the pilots fought to slow it down. In the cabin, passengers screamed, then fell silent. The plane screeched to a stop. For a moment, nothing. Then cheers erupted. People sobbed, hugged strangers, shouted in pure relief. They had survived. Rebecca exhaled, her hands trembling. She turned to Jackson, who was leaning back in his seat, arms crossed, completely unfazed. "I told you," he said with a smirk. "Ain't nobody dying today." Aftermath. As emergency crews rushed onto the runway, the passengers were escorted off the plane one by one. Rebecca stayed behind, ensuring everything was in order. Jackson, meanwhile, stepped out into the blinding sunlight, stretching like he had just finished a casual workout. Reporters swarmed him. "Mr. Jackson, how did you manage to stop the hijackers? Did you really fix the hydraulics? Was it like snakes on a plane?" Jackson put on his sunglasses. "Man, this was way worse than snakes." The crowd laughed. But then, in the midst of all the noise, Rebecca approached. For the first time, her voice was soft. "Mr. Jackson." He turned to her, raising an eyebrow. She swallowed, feeling a lump in her throat. "I was wrong about you," he chuckled. "Yeah, I know." She hesitated, then held out her hand. "Thank you." Jackson looked at her hand, then grinned. Instead of shaking it, he pulled her into a quick, one-armed hug. "Don't mention it," he said. "But next time, maybe don't kick me out of first class." Rebecca actually laughed. Never again. Epilogue. Viral sensation. By the time Samuel L. Jackson reached his destination, the internet had exploded. Hashtag Jackson Saves the Day was trending worldwide. Clips of the passengers cheering for him flooded social media. The video of him giving his legendary in-flight pep talk hit 50 million views overnight. And somewhere, deep inside an airline HR office, an executive sighed, looking at a news report. Airline official apologizes after flight attendant removed Samuel L. Jackson from first class. Turns out he's a damn hero. The executive rubbed his temples. Well, we're screwed. Jackson, watching the news from his hotel, just grinned. Damn right you are.